We'd love to welcome you to this. It's really our first in a series of webinars where we're exploring this idea of centering youth thriving and what it means for learning ecosystems. It's the first webinar in a series that's part of a major kind of cross-fields alignment effort that we're co-creating with leaders of dozens of networks and alliances and campaigns that each in their own way are working to improve systems and conditions for young people. And we've really been coming together around this idea of thriving as a shared goal, thinking about the major shifts and the big swings that a focus on youth thriving really requires of all the systems and the ecosystems that young people are navigating every day. We're all seeing the headlines, we're tracking them. We know from our own personal experience that there are many reasons to be concerned about how young people are doing today. Challenges were evident before the pandemic, but the pandemic and in many cases our institutional responses to it have really accelerated these challenges, whether we're talking about mental health, chronic absenteeism, learning loss, lack of workforce readiness. They're all different things that we're tracking, but it's also just made our efforts to address these challenges both more important and also more complex. It may seem counterintuitive, but the science tells us that the best way to address these individual challenges, and those of you who know us well know we've been saying this for decades now, it's the best way to address them is to take them together in a way that really is not just comprehensive, but also acknowledges the assets and the opportunities. By focusing on youth thriving, really looking at what it takes to be productive, connected, and healthy, and how those things connect, it really helps us think about these things, I think, in a different way. Zooming in and focusing on what's really happening for adolescents, for youth, for teens and young adults, helps us really think about the importance of the second decade of life and all the places and spaces that they really are navigating on a daily basis, which takes us to that idea of really the complexity and the dynamic thriving of ecosystems, and that their ecosystems currently exist, but are they as healthy and dynamic as we want them to be, as places where young people really spend their time and engage and create and grow. So the kinds of questions that we've been tackling together as a group really are how do we in these times really shift the focus from deficits and scarcity over to one that's really more about assets and abundance. And what are we really talking about when we're talking about a thriving ecosystem? So today's call, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce partner in this work, Karen Pittman, who's going to spend time interviewing two of our favorite leaders in this space. A longtime friend and colleague, Tom Akiva, is associate professor in the Department of Health and Human Development at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education, and newer friend, but equally and profoundly inspirational, Tyler Samstag is the executive director of Remake Learning. Both of them happen to be based up there in Pittsburgh, and we are just delighted that they're joining us today to help us really wrap our heads around this idea of learning ecosystems. Karen?
Thank you, Merita. And it's really great to have Tom and Tyler on the screen. Is this the first time the two of you have been presenting together?
I believe so.
Well, it's great to have you, and we're looking forward to the insights. So Merita described that ecosystems are complex and dynamic, but so are people, and so are systems, and so are communities. So how does this idea of really digging into what a learning ecosystem is, how does that help systems and communities help young people thrive? Let's think about the definition of this a little bit before we go to the specific examples from Pittsburgh. So Tom, I want to start with you. And for each of you, we've pulled up one of our favorite quotes from your colleagues and your work. And so Tom, we're going to start with a quote from you, and you can take some time to just explain to us why this idea of learning ecosystems is so important.
Sure. Well, this is a quote from two of my colleagues who I work closely with and very much enjoy working with. I'll just read it first and then kind of dive in. Using ecological thinking changes the way we see the ecosystem itself. It is no longer a collection of participants and learning places with separate essences that need to be connected for individual children. Instead, the learning ecosystem emerges as a constellation of intertwined and entangled elements where learning happens through dynamic relational processes among the people, places, and stuff we find across, within, between school and out of school places. So thanks for that introduction, Karen. The quote here and what my colleagues and I have been doing is trying to take ecological thinking from biological ecosystem work like restoration ecology and see what we might apply to human development, or in this case, out of school and school-based learning ecologies. So it's new. It's not just we need to collaborate better. It's reframing how we even think about education and development, and the sort of implications that has. So a few points about that. First, the word ecosystem is being used all the time these days. Often people use it just to mean like, you know, all the networks that get your products to you, that sort of thing. We don't mean it that way. Ecosystems come in all sizes. You have an ecosystem in your stomach and your intestines. That is a balance, you know, hopefully it's in balance. We have ecosystems that are like forest sizes. The entire Earth is actually an ecosystem. And so they come in all sizes, and it just means a sort of collection, usually of living and non-living things that are in some kind of relative harmony or balance, at least for a time being. Ecosystems are made up of dynamic interactions. That was one of the lines in the quote up there. This is a really key point, right? So there's big implications for this. It's adults and children constantly interacting and shaping the ecosystem as we go. So in most of our models, we put child at the center, and we feel pretty good about saying we're organizing everything around the well-being of that child. The problem is when we do that, we have the possibility of ignoring all the other humans in the system. So children are dynamic parts of the ecosystem. They're not the subject of the ecosystem. So we need to sort of think about all of the parts of the ecosystem and how they work together. So in other words, you know, we have to consider the adults who work with youth as an important member of the ecosystem and make sure they get what they need. And if we only focus on youth and sort of selfless serving of youth, then that'll actually hurt youth in the end. The spaces between ecosystems are really important, maybe as important as the spaces within ecosystems themselves. So hallways and lunchrooms in schools, for example, are sort of like, if you think of classroom ecosystems, we focus a lot on those. We focus less on the spaces in between. Sometimes those are called ecotones, if you want to get fancy. But all sorts of learning happens there, right? And so in between schools and youth programs, the spaces there, the transportation, all of the different spaces. If we want to move towards an ecosystem way of thinking and way of doing, we need to think about those spaces in between. I wanted to mention one more thing about dynamic interactions that sometimes can help what a shift in ecosystem thinking really means. And that's the difference between complex and complicated. So complicated, it's complicated to make an iPhone, right? It involves very specialized machines, and they etch a gazillion little components on those little silicon chips in there. And it's way beyond my knowledge of how to do that. It's complicated. But once you can do that, you can mass produce gazillions of iPhones, right? It's linear, it's predictable, it's complicated. That's what complicated means. Complex, on the other hand, raising a child is complex. The difference is it's dynamic, ever-changing. I have 3 girls. If I raised them all the exact same way, they would not come out the same way. Children are actually, they're agents in the system, so they're pushing back at the system all the time. They're changing in response to the system. You know, physical materials don't do that. So when we think about like developing an ecosystem of learning and development, we need different tools than the kind of tools we put into developing a phone or the tools we use for medicine. We need tools that help us do adaptive management of dynamic changing systems. So this also suggests a shift in measurement. We could start thinking about not just individual success, but we could think about measuring ecosystem health, the health and wellness of an ecosystem itself. And once we make that kind of a shift, it has implications on where we put our efforts.
No, you're just coming back on screen, Karen. Thanks. We just wrapped up with Tom's piece, and I want to loop back Tom on that part of how you measure ecosystem health, but we'll come back to that when we do more of the questions part, which I've been kind of gathering along the way. And then now I think we're at the point where we wanted Tyler to kind of share with us from his work in Pittsburgh. And Tom, we'll come back to that piece on the mapping you've done on the actual ecosystems around arts in Pittsburgh. But let's look at how Tyler's been talking about this, because this has been one of my favorite sort of plain English descriptions of what is it we're thinking about when we're thinking about ecosystems. Tyler, tell us a little bit about this, and also there's the shifts document and what you do there with Remake Learning.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm first and foremost honored to present with Tom. Tom is a partner in this work and a friend. Thank you to KP Catalyst for this opportunity, and shout out to all of our folks from Pittsburgh on the line. And so this quote here came from our most recent publication that was put out in partnership with the Grable Foundation in Pittsburgh called Shift. And this is the third of what we call our ecosystem trilogy, the first being our Remake Learning Playbook, which came out after about 10 years of doing this work in the region. We had a second publication called Pittsburgh Principles that came out as we approached our 15th year. And we're quickly approaching 2 decades of stewarding an ecosystem in Pittsburgh. And that is when we put out Shift. And so this is a quote from Shift that talks about what our ecosystem is here in Pittsburgh. And it says, learning ecosystems may be found anywhere, but it takes careful stewardship to help them thrive. In cities and suburbs, small towns and rural villages, communities are beginning to recognize the people, places, resources, and experiences that help young people learn as a part of a complex, dynamic web of relationships. These communities are taking steps to cultivate their learning ecosystems to serve children and youth better. So as we look at an ecosystem in the greater Pittsburgh region, first and foremost, I think we take it very serious in this region to lean into our legacies. And we have a number of legacies, but notably, Pittsburgh is Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. It's where Mr. Rogers was created and filmed over the years. And I grew up watching Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and beyond kind of an entity that existed at intersections, Mr. Rogers lived at the intersection of public broadcasting, but educational technology and the learning sciences with his relationship with the University of Pittsburgh. I think Mr. Rogers' neighborhood also really beautifully exemplified the concept of an ecosystem. And so growing up watching Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, we saw Mr. Rogers recognize the many places that learning exists in one community. I remember vividly when Mr. Rogers went to the crayon factory and we learned how crayons were built or how they were made. And so looking at all these sites of learning that exist in one's backyard, and my colleagues Greg Baer and Ryan Radesky wrote a whole book about this. But Pittsburgh is Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and that very much has informed what we have done here in Pittsburgh. And so another quote from that Shift publication is that families routinely look for and find enriching, meaningful, and fulfilling learning experiences outside of school. We saw that especially take place during the pandemic when families were forced to look beyond the confines of a school classroom or a school day to find really enriching learning experiences. And so, in Pittsburgh, we're not a huge city, but we are rich in resources. And so in Pittsburgh, we have some incredible museums. We have a plethora of truly inspiring out of school time organizations. We have a high concentration of universities and institutions of higher education. We have really incredible parks that exist around our region. And so these are all sites that I think traditionally people experience learning. That's not shocking. But also in Pittsburgh, we have places like Astrobotic. This is a newer company that is actually designing space shuttles to go into space. We have Shell Games, a gaming company who are creating these, virtual reality educational games. We have the Max Ivanka murals in a Croatian church right outside of Pittsburgh, which is this inspiring artwork that was painted in the 30s and 40s, telling about the immigrant experience into Pittsburgh. And we have Rivers of Steel, a nonprofit that is protecting heritage sites all across Pittsburgh. And so, although each one of these organizations obviously have their own missions and visions and their programs, there is this shared goal for Pittsburgh, and it is Pittsburgh as a thriving region. And that cannot happen without making it an incredible place for young people to live, work, and play. And so Remake Learning, or what is now referred to as Remake Learning, started in 2007. It didn't have a name at that point. And it was organically just a conversation amongst people who were grappling with something that was taking place in 2007. And in 2007, what that was the release of the first iPhone. And so there was this huge technological shift that educators were really grappling with. How do we integrate technology into the classroom? What will this mean for the future of learning? And it was just an organic conversation around breakfast in which some folks who were doing some really innovative work started sharing what they were doing. And that led to, we should do this more often. We should invite more people. And here we are in 2024 as we approach 20 years. And really what it looks like in practice when folks are coming together across organizational lines and sector lines. It's a school and a museum and an architecture firm teaming up to create a school that offers the same inspiration as a children's museum. And so when a young person goes into a children's museum, instantly they light up and there's a lot of opportunity for self-directed learning. And that's the case for the Seneca Valley School District, who partnered with the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh and Canon Design to redesign an elementary school to replicate the feeling of a children's museum. It's a school and an airport coming together. And so that's, we have the South Allegheny School District and the Allegheny County Airport who came together. There was a teacher during the pandemic whose passion project was to learn how to fly, and he wanted to provide that opportunity to young people. And so partnering with the Allegheny County Airport, they are creating pathways for young people to start to the process of getting credentialed to become a pilot in high school. It's schools and businesses coming together. It's like the South Fayette School District in All-Clad. All-Clad is they make skillets. And so there are factories actually around that school. And every year, All-Clad goes into the school with some of their biggest challenges. And they pose those challenges to high school students who use human-centered design and engineering to create solutions. And then they present those solutions to the company. They've taken a number of these solutions and have actually integrated them into their manufacturing process. And then lastly, it's schools and higher ed coming together. It's like the Create Lab, which exists in Carnegie Mellon University. So somebody doing his PhD work on robotics and elementary education, who started prototyping what could it look like when young people start to design and program robots. And that eventually led to a spin-off company called Bird Brain Technologies, who creates products for young people to create robotics, which I don't think would have been possible without those early cross-sector collaborations. And so that's what it looks like with Remake Learning in Pittsburgh.
Well, Tyler, you've given us an amazing sort of set of examples, and I know it's just a tip of the iceberg of what's been going on over the past 20 years, of the kinds of places and unusual partnerships that had happened because of this commitment to remake learning, this commitment to really recognize and grow a thriving ecosystem. But let's get Tom back on the screen and let's talk a little bit about the people that are behind the shifts in people that need to happen in order to get these relationships going. So Tom, in your definition, you really emphasize the dynamic relationships. The interactions are important. And we often think about those as interactions with children, but what I hear Tyler talking about is the need to really amp up the interactions between adults who are in different places, who are in different organizations, who think they have different roles. And those are the kind of shifts that are in your shift document. So let's talk a little bit about that. Catherine, if you want to put the shifts document up on the screen, we were delighted to have our two essential to fail paper be quoted in the shifts document, but the shifts that Tyler and Remake Learning have outlined as a shifts in how our mindsets have to shift in order to really take advantage of all of the abundance of opportunities and places and people in relationships, in communities. And so let's talk a little bit about how the two definitions that you just presented go together. Tyler emphasized places. Tom, you emphasize people. How do we bring this mix together?
So can I want to draw attention to Tyler. One of the first things you said was people, places, and experiences. People, places, and experiences, which is actually almost exactly the framing we put in our ecosystem book. That if you sort of think broadly about all the adults who are out there with all the various expertise. And then we have structures like schools and youth programs and things that are in place that were created decades and decades and decades ago. And I think what Tyler described is new ways of moving past our old systems to better pair people, places, and experiences, right? And so that first box on the shift publication is shifting the way that I forget the words. The red one. It's like how the adults that power the learning ecosystem interact. When I first came to Pittsburgh 12 years ago, I was introduced to what became Remake Learning, and I was blown away by the opportunity to find other adults who cared about the learning ecosystem and wanted to figure out ways to collaborate to make things better for children and youth. And that's to me, one of the biggest contributions of Remake Learning is to provide those spaces that open up opportunities, not for kids directly, but for adults who work with young people, or in my case, who study things, to get together and talk about in this sort of atmosphere of opportunity, right? Like this as Merita opened, this atmosphere of abundance. So yeah, shifting how the adults power the learning ecosystem is a lot about how they interact with each other.
And Tom, I know that you have a favorite wonky term that you use for those adults that when we did our meeting in April, people love that term. So can you talk a little bit about the keystone species and what that means to say we really have to start to think about ecosystems as increasing connections between adults?
Sure, yeah, and I think that of all the taking biological ecosystem theory and applying it to education, that's probably the most important part. So there's this idea of keystone species, which you all have probably heard somewhere along the line. It's an animal or a species in an ecosystem that has an unusually large effect on that ecosystem. So the classic example is in Yellowstone Park. The wolves died out. Gray wolf, I think, died out over a period of decades. And they reintroduced them. And that reintroduction had all kinds of effects. I was reading a recent paper on this. I don't remember the details now, but like it affected like beaver populations, right? So things that you wouldn't even expect were made better by reintroducing this keystone species because it's sort of a linchpin. So my colleagues and I, like we thought about what is the keystone species in this world that we work in, and it's probably adults who work with young people, right? And so if you think about that in terms of a keystone species, the implications are, what if we put a lot of love and energy into the adults who work with young people? Way more than we do, typically. What kind of an effect might that have on the entire ecosystem? And remake learning is a great idea of one way to do that. I mean, I think, hey, and healthcare is another way, which we could talk about, but providing opportunities for adults to get together and celebrate. Remake Learning does a great job at celebrating educators, formal and informal educators. And that's, putting energy into the keystone, strengthening the keystone species, which then radiates out into the entire learning ecosystem.
So Tyler, let's talk a little bit more about, you told us how remake learning began. Let's talk a little bit more about your theories and the key pieces of remake learning that you've put in place over the past 20 years that really support this ecosystem.
Absolutely. And so I have some slides that I can share. And so the question often that is posed to us is, how do you actually steward? We use that term often, steward an ecosystem. And ecosystems will exist in the region whether or not there's an entity stewarding it. And so there are some kind of very clear strategies. We call them our network support strategies that we captured in our Remake Learning Playbook that really it's been the strategies that we've utilized from our beginning, and very much today are still the strategies that we utilize. And so just taking a look at the context, I shared a little bit about the origin of remake learning. But again, in 2007, it was a group of educators and technologists, community leaders coming together over food. Food has been such a key part of our origin story. And ultimately, though, as we started bringing people together, the conversations led to questions like, how might we rethink where, how, and why learning happens across the greater Pittsburgh region? As we approached 10 years of stewarding this ecosystem in Pittsburgh, that was a kind of key point where the goal was to really solidify and crowdsource what is the mission and vision and values of this collective work across the region. And it was at that point that we were really starting to see impact of approaching this work through an ecosystemic lens. There were huge investments on behalf of our philanthropic community in the region on rethinking what learning and partnership looks like. But really kind of explicitly that we started to see large numbers of educators innovating in their classrooms and environments. We were seeing learning spaces reimagined, whether that was a local Carnegie library or a library in a elementary school that's transitioned into a makerspace. And here we are, 2024, and we kind of define remake learning as a network that ignites engaging, relevant, and equitable learning practices in support of young people navigating rapid social and technological change. We have grown to well over 800 organizations in southwestern Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia. And again, although we all have unique missions and visions, what really unites us is kind of this shared vision of what we want learning to look like. And so years ago, we brought hundreds of network members together to create a profile of a learner, really inspired by how many districts were creating profiles of a graduate. And this ultimately, though, are the values we want to see in learning for all young people in the region. I especially love that bottom one. It's learners are connected across all of the places that they live, work, and play. And so how we actually steward this ecosystem, so much of it happens behind the scenes, but these are our 5 network support strategies. We call them our 5 C's. And so I'll quickly go through what each of these look like for us. And so first and foremost, we convene. And so we are constantly trying to bring people together across organizational lines, make that just part of the norm in the region. And so throughout the year, there are tons of free events. Some of them are topic specific. And so we might have a meetup, for example, around a topic of shared interest, maybe artificial intelligence, maybe the arts. But here you could go and, around a table might be a college professor, a kindergarten teacher, an out of school time educator, and an executive director of out of school time or nonprofit organization. And so as we create kind of this expectation where people are coming together across organizational lines, what really organically happens is that topics of shared interest start to surface. And truly, this does happen quite organically. And so one of the things that Remake Learning looks to do is to constantly be taking note of what are those emerging topics that people are interested in. And so continuously, we bring together working groups. And so through working groups, it's an opportunity for us to asset map, see who's doing what within this space in the region, identify where there are opportunity areas or gaps that when we join forces, we can either, really accelerate opportunity spaces, or we can start to address gaps. And so we've had quite a few working groups over the years. You can see them up here. Some of these are really time-bound and deliverable-based. Others are just continuous opportunities to bring people together around topics of shared interest. A great example is our newest working group has a focus on civics education. So there are all different organizations interested in what the future of civics education can look like. And so our most recent working group is focused on that. As you bring people together on a regular basis, as you start to coordinate efforts, people start to dream really big. What happens when a roboticist from Carnegie Mellon University might join forces with a librarian in a middle school? For us, oftentimes we bring people together, we brainstorm ideas, they're put onto Post-it notes and put up on the wall. Many, many great ideas. Catalyzing these ideas has also been a core strategy for us, and we do so through grant opportunities. And so throughout Remake Learning's history, there has been a catalytic grant funding component to the work. Sometimes these have been spark grants. And so lots of small grants happening at the same time. These might be $1,500 grants, $7,500 grants, but hundreds of these grants happening throughout the region at the same time. And then we bring them together in a showcase fashion so everyone can learn from one another. Our Moonshot grants are our most recent grant opportunity. This was launched in 2020. These are grants of up to $70,000. And the application itself is an exercise in future. And so we ask organizations to think boldly about the future, 10 years into the future, what learning would look like, and to pitch an idea in kind of an R&D fashion of something you can do today to test what would be needed to catalyze movement for this preferred future. And then we communicate. So as we start to see various organizations around the region successfully remake learning or shift what learning looks like in the region, the goal is to really capture it and tell that story so other people can be inspired by and replicate it. And so Remake Learning regularly puts out various publications and videos. Again, key here is to really capture what it looks like when people rethink partnership, rethink learning, and to provide very key supports for other people to learn from it. And then lastly, this is one that we have shifted ourselves in the last couple of years, but we originally captured this strategy as champion, but we are more and more using the language of celebrates. And so how can we celebrate both education as a profession, but also just this kind of ethos of ecosystem and partnership? And a key way we do that is Remake Learning Days. And so Remake Learning Days started in 2016. It actually started when we observed that there was a key group of educators missing from our ecosystem. And that key group was parents and caregivers. And so Remake Learning Days started as a festival, 2 weeks, where organizations all over the region would open their doors, and young people and their parents and caregivers could go from the library to the community center to the school and engage in hands-on active learning. And so these are, pictures from Remake Learning Days events over the years. But what started here in 2016 as an idea to engage parents and caregivers has really grown just exponentially across the country and more recently across the world. And so in 2024, every year, Remake Learning Days happens in May. We strategically do it right before the summertime, so parents and caregivers can experience learning in all different sites of learning. But here were our various festivals. And so we support other regions in creating their own festival in their regions. And so we have a handful across the United States with support from our Department of Education in Pennsylvania. We very strategically expanded across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And then last year we had our first international festivals. We had a festival in Doncaster, which is about 2 hours north of London. We had it in 11 states in Uruguay, as well as Christchurch, New Zealand, and then pop-up events. This past year, we had pop-up events where anybody could host an event during Remake Learning Days. As far as Antarctica and Africa, there were events hosted. And so what does this look like? Again, the key for Remake Learning Days is also to just highlight the many sites of learning in really diverse settings across a region. And so this is Shell Games. I mentioned Shell Games originally. They are a gaming company situated in Pittsburgh. And every year they have an open house of their offices. And young people and their families can come in and see what it looks like and experience what it feels like to work in a gaming company. And so they make every year their CEO available, their head of HR, their head of finance, their head of the programming division. And young people can go up, they can test new games, and they can talk to people who actually work at Shell Games. It's a big hit every year. Lunar Settlers was an event that took place at the Moonshot Museum. And so I shared Astrobotics is a company who's actively creating space shuttles to send to outer space. They created within their headquarters a section that is the Moonshot Museum. So they open it up to young people. And part of the Moonshot Museum, which is really cool, is they have a huge glass window that you can actually see the engineers building space shuttles in real time. And so they open their offices at Astrobotics so young people come in and experience that. Something I really love, Pittsburgh. About 25 minutes outside of Pittsburgh, you are very much in rural Pennsylvania. And so every year, the Pennsylvania Friends of Agriculture Foundation, they host something called Farmer Fridays. And one of their goals is to showcase how agriculture and the farming industry is innovating within itself. And so last year, they had a tour of a farm that after burning down has rebuilt themselves as a fully autonomous, robotic-driven dairy farm. And so we got to virtually tour this farm and see how they've integrated robotics into agriculture. And so really at its core, we see our work as stewarding this ecosystem. Our goal is to spark new ways of learning. These are shifts that we presented in our shift publication. Really, again, as we approach 2 decades, the goal of this publication was to dive really deep into this work and explore how network members over years and decades, how it's led to various shifts in kind of the DNA here in the region. And we identified some kind of key shifts. It was educators were shifting how they viewed themselves and one another's, from colleagues to neighbors. Organizations shifted how they view one another, from competitors to collaborators. Larger systems shift from being static to more dynamic. And then we look at the people who we are aiming to serve. Children were shifting from students to learners. And then lastly, families shifted from being involved to being engaged. And really at the heart of what we do, though, is this kind of ethos that we work better when we work together.
Tyler, this is an amazing presentation, and Rebecca Goldberg has put a very long question for you in the chat, which I want you to read, but not answer right now. You've emphasized so much the importance of making space for people and trusting. I think trust is in there, trusting that people, when you give them room and opportunities to come together, that abundance of sharing their assets comes forth. And Rebecca's asking, does money matter? What are the critical components? I think you outlined some of those critical components in your shifts document, but we want to come back to really embrace this idea that we really can get much more people power out of communities, out of the public, out of our organizations, out of our businesses, and out of the people in everyday places and spaces, which is one of the things that the campaign for grade level reading focuses on. We may have them on in a later webinar as we're talking about ecosystems, because they said, if we're going to help young people read, we need to get any adult that sees kids and their families together. And they said, what about barbershops? What about laundromats? What about getting all those places where families go together and have downtime, making those people in those places, giving them the tools and the competence to help families become better readers with their kids. So we've got so many ideas about how we can really activate the whole community. I'm going to come back to talk to you more about that, but I want to shift gears for a minute, get Tom back on screen and zoom in on the creative arts landscape in Pittsburgh, because this is where we've got organizations that we normally think of as youth development organizations serving young people in programmatic ways. And how did ecosystem thinking help you think about them differently and help them think about themselves differently, Tom?
Okay, I will try to do all of that.
Do it all.
Wait, there. Okay. So I'm going to give just a couple quick examples that are we wanted to think about how do you study these things. Tyler, you just presented a bunch of shifts which are studyable, which are totally sound. And Tyler and I have talked about how do you get at ecosystem health? How can you measure this sort of thing? This is a few years old. I'm going to share a few. I mean, it's been going for several years. A few studies, 2 studies, to try to get at an ecosystem perspective, specifically on the creative learning ecosystem in Pittsburgh. So that's youth arts programs, visual arts, music, dance, drama, all those. And I could easily spend an hour and a half on this. So I'm going to go really, and the things I skip might be the questions you have. So feel free to ask questions. 2 research questions. What does creative learning ecosystem look like? And what's the role of creative learning programs in the ecosystem? To address the first, and this was a partnership with Heinz Endowments, who was exploring a funding area around creative learning. They have a creativity area, they have a learning area, and they wanted to see what was in between, basically. We brought in a whole bunch of people to do focus groups, and these are all the leaders of the arts museums and the larger youth programs that do arts and dance and music and drama. And we did this series of focus groups. And at the beginning of each focus group, we asked each of these people. Now, these are people that think about the arts across the city, right? And as Tyler said, we're a small city, but we're not a teeny city. We're a real city, but we're small enough that a lot of people know each other. So we said, okay, 5 minutes. I want you to list all of the creative learning programs in the city that you can think of. And then I want you to circle the ones that you think are the most important. And they're like, well, how do you define most important? Well, that's up to you. You define it. And we had them do that. And then we had them present those. And it led to a beautiful conversation. And because we then asked them, how did you decide what was important? And that got at some of the values of the folks. But we took all of the names that they listed and we did a modified version of social network analysis. And that led to a picture like this. When you do social network analysis, you get a lot of pictures and you never know which one to show because you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can see the network in lots of different ways. But these are, so we networked programs. We looked at how programs connect. This is not a geographical network. This is kind of proximity to each other. It has to do with how many times a program is named, who names it. The algorithm sort of creates a web that tells you all these sorts of things, and you can tell the tell the computer all kinds of things you want to see. We also looked at size of programs based on their budgets submitted in their tax returns, and so the size of the node in this picture is the size of the budget. A few things that we learned from this exercise. First, there's a gazillion creative learning organizations. We did not exhaust the list. We got to about 250, but we did not exhaust the list. Size does not determine network centrality. So network centrality you can kind of think of as popularity almost. It's how often something is named. So it gives you a sense of how well you're known in a community. Larger organizations tend to be named more, so there is a correlation. But we found a few very small organizations, like under $500,000 organizations, that were named as frequently as the giant museums. So there are folks who are very active in the network, very out there, but are very small and lean. We also did something that allowed us to see subnetworks. One had a concentration of small Black arts centering organizations. So we actually wrote a whole paper on this, about how so there was this sort of subnetwork and how they were talking about different things a little bit. But yeah, so this kind of an approach is kind of a play on a needs assessment or some of the more simpler ways to do this kind of thing, but it's really getting at that dynamic interaction and allowed us to do a lot more. Second question, what's the role of creative learning programs in the ecosystem? I'm going to give a real quick version of this because this was like a 3-year project with a global pandemic in the middle where all the programs closed, so we couldn't visit them, right? But we did pretty intensive visits at 16 youth arts programs. So we went back multiple times, had these meetings, and we invited teens and teaching artists who are typically in their 20s, sometimes 30s, sometimes older, but they were the adults. And we had group meetings, 90 minutes each. The first meeting, we asked them to tell stories about their time at their program. That's it. I mean, lots of stuff around that, but that was it. And they get up and they tell their story and everybody clap and we'd ask questions and it was story time. And then we transcribed the whole meeting and came back to them and said, here's all the stories you told us. We gave them paper with them all printed out. Now let's see if we can make sense of all these stories to figure out what this place is about, right? So that's a basically participatory qualitative analysis, thematic analysis that we did with each group. That led to a report for every site. And then we took those themes. So every site came up with 3 to 5 themes. And we did a themes of themes analysis. So across all the sites, what do they say again and again? We even involved ChatGPT. That's a whole nother story. I can tell you that. We asked the AI to analyze these data as well, but for another webinar. So themes of themes, and this is what came out. A lot of these are what you'd expect to see in any kind of youth development or positive youth development programs. Intrapersonal development, artistic opportunity, personal growth, supportive learning environment, holistic learning program community, and then outcomes and opportunities. The one thing I want to highlight is professional opportunities. Now remember, these are youth arts programs. Not one mentioned any kind of, we want to prepare these kids to do well in school. We were looking for that, but it never came out. What we got were programs thinking about helping kids think about the future, right? And it wasn't, we want to train these folks to be professional ballerinas necessarily. It wasn't that at all. It was it was being exposed to and thinking about future opportunities. So before coming here, I had nothing I really wanted to do in life, but I kind of found something that I could make a career out of here. I think that was at we have a welding program. I think that was at our welding program. We also have well, we have all kinds of programs, all kinds of various arts. So we sort of argued then that the role of creative learning programs in the ecosystem is not to support school goals necessarily, but to be part of a dynamic set of opportunities that help kids with exposure and see potential futures.
That's great, Tom. And there are questions that are coming up. I want to make sure we have time to answer them. But a question that just came up immediately is, are there outcomes on research or research on publications that measure the impact of learning ecosystems? In other words, as a grant writer, someone's asking, is there a way to bring this information in to show the impact that a healthy ecosystem has on young people? Are we there yet? Do we have those measures yet? A quick answer. Yes, no, maybe. So. No, there you go. A quick answer. Yes.
We are just starting to figure out ways to do this well. And I think it's an exciting area that will continue to grow in the next decade or longer.
Wonderful. I think some of Rebecca's questions got answered as Tyler continued, but Tyler, did you have a chance to look at Rebecca's question? You want to give us a quick answer or two?
Yeah, quickly. For the first part, for us, it really is those 5 strategies. And we look at all of our work as being at the intersection of all 5 of those strategies. They don't happen linear, for example, but oftentimes folks talk about the grant making. And to be clear, for a decade and a half, the grant making really was catalytic grant funding. They were small funds. It was this idea of when you bring people together and they start to dream about what could be, catalytic funding just provides just enough funding to test something else. And if it isn't successful, you can still learn something from that. So for a long time, that grant funding was quite small. Regarding are there groups of organizations that are harder to kind of bring into this work? I think the analogy of the keystone species is so important for Remake Learning. Specifically, Remake Learning very strategically brought on intermediaries over the years. And it might be for formal education, it's the intermediate unit system, which is the statewide intermediary between the State Department of Education, the 500 school districts across the state. It's the APOST, which is an organization that supports out-of-school time. It is the Arts Education Collaborative, which looks at arts and education. And as we look at our work over the span of almost 2 decades, each one of those intermediaries has their own ecosystem. And very much, I think, how they engage has been heavily dependent on the health of that keystone species. And so when maybe one of these intermediary organizations were in a period of transition or less healthy, I think for periods of time, it is harder to engage new members within that kind of unique ecosystem or to keep people engaged. And so, I think that's a great analogy with the health of keystone species.
That's great. I know we're running out of time. Dan asked a question about sort of the impact on youth identity formation and things like that. And I think we can get to that a little bit later on or in another episode, another part of the webinar series. But in our minute that's left, I just want to emphasize, and Tyler, you're bringing up intermediaries is important, that the structures that we need to steward ecosystems are different than the structures that we need to reform systems. And the conversation you all have had for the past hour is so important because it basically emphasizes we have to give people room and reasons to connect. And then we have to support those connections, whether those connections at the organizational level or at the personal level. And when we do that, so much more happens. But this is a shift from thinking that we have to do top-down approaches to reform, that you have to sort of nudge and incentivize people to do things that you want them to do versus just giving them more freedom to come together and connect and let that abundance of assets come out. So it's a different way of thinking. And the mindset shifts that you outline are so important. I know we're out of time. I'm going to hand it back to Merita. It's been an exciting hour that went by too quickly, even though I missed 3 minutes of it by losing my computer power. But Merita, tell us what happens next.
We didn't even tell people that you were off screen for a while. And we are just delighted that we're diving into these topics more deeply with folks, and are going to have a series of webinars coming up over the summer as we head into fall. So Karen and I are doing the next one, really exploring more the themes of Too Essential to Fail. Michelle Cahill from XQ Institute and some other colleagues are going to be coming to talk with us really about the what does it really make to have strong systems as a part of ecosystems, and how are we thinking about that with the education system. Josh Schachter, which I know many of you are fans of his work in Tucson and what he's spreading across the country with community share and the idea of like the human library, and how are we really connecting at the keystone species level, adults that are trying to really work together to create those really engaging, interest-driven learning opportunities for young people. And then wrapping up with Andrew Frischman and Peter McWalters. Hi, Peter, on the call today, talking about what we can learn from big picture learning in terms of what it takes to really create those spaces, and then have a conversation of how are we taking this as we're moving, it's kind of saturating in places in ecosystems. What does it take to create an ecosystem and partners around learning, and then move it more broadly throughout the community and the region. So excited for those upcoming webinars. And if there's any other information, any of you that have not connected in on the Centering Youth Thriving work and you'd like to find out more about it, you've got our contact info. Just send me an email and we will loop you in. Thank you so much for joining today, and have a great 4th of July.